24 disturbing clips, 7 levels. I've compiled some of the most disturbing footage ever caught on camera into this iceberg, so let's start at the very tip. Level 1. He felt the shark before he saw it. What happened next shocked thousands of people who witnessed it live on screens around the world. On July 19, 2015, Mick Fanning, a 3-time Australian world champion, was paddling out into the chilling waters off Jeffreys Bay, South Africa, waiting for his next wave in the J-Bay Open Finals. Suddenly, he felt something brush against him under the water. Moments later, a tall, dark fin appeared. It was a great white shark. Fanning was immediately thrown into a struggle for his life, and viewers could only wait and see who would come out on top. The next moment, he had disappeared into the water. Rescue teams quickly closed in on boats, expecting the worst. Fanning would later say how he had only just managed to escape.
And so it's thrashing, and I'm trying to put my board between me and the shark, and then all of a sudden I just get this whack.
He had kept the board wedged between himself and the shark and punched it as hard as he could. Eventually, the shark bit through his leash and snapped free, as if deciding the struggle wasn't worth its hunger. Fanning got away unscathed, but when he spoke, you could hear the shock in his quivering voice.
It was big enough, it came up, and I got stuck in my leg rope.
The incident rattled the surfing community, and the remainder of the competition was cancelled. They ended up giving both finalists a shared victory and splitting the prize money. But Fanning didn't let this near-death encounter faze him, and less than a week later, he was back in the water doing what he loved. They say the sky is big enough for everyone, but that wasn't the case that June day in 2015. Experienced base jumper Scott Frankson and his friend had just jumped off a 300-foot cliff in the Superstition Mountains of Arizona. One jumper was supposed to arc wide, turning his body and canopy in a sweeping descent, while the other kept a separate flight path. But that wasn't what happened. The two ended up colliding with each other. The force of it cut several lines and deflated half of Scott's chute. What was supposed to be a planned, graceful separation was now a violent tangle fall. The pair spun around each other, one's chute was shredded, while the other held onto his full parachute. Both were spinning towards the rocks below. It looked like the end. Then, just when it seemed like all hope was lost, a miracle occurred. The chutes somehow untangled themselves on the way down, not through skill or strategy, but just plain old luck. They landed battered and bruised, but alive. A reminder that even when technology and training feel bulletproof in nature, anything can happen. On May 24, 2015, French skier Benjamin Spilthoren was slicing down the icy slopes of Strahlhorn Mountain in the Swiss Alps, when in a heartbeat, everything changed. The surface had suddenly given way to a glacial crevasse, and things only got worse for him. Benjamin had plunged 30 feet into a frozen void. He was all alone, and there was no way to get out without risking an even deeper fall. He did the only thing he could do. He called for help.
Let's go!
17 long minutes passed, and then, by chance, a Swiss ski party descending the same glacier heard a distant cry.
Wait!
Their guide had immediately come up with a rescue plan. Benjamin would use his pickaxe to climb out, and they would hold onto a rope just in case the crevasse gave out and collapsed. Carefully, Benjamin climbed back up, eventually making it to solid ground. He was shaken and suffered only minor injuries, but that footage captured a truth most skiers try not to think about. On glaciers, the line between thrill and peril is as thin as glass and flimsy as snow. Level 2. On the day Vicente Alem took to the sky on his paraglider, the sky was everything a pilot dreams of, clear and quiet. But machines have a way of turning on their users in an instant. When Alem was about 100 meters off the ground, the paraglider that should have carried him gently in the sky began to descend rapidly. wing had collapsed, and in that fraction of a second, everything shifted from calm flight to spiraling free fall to the hard ground. By then, Alem's chute had tangled with everything else, and he was in a frantic struggle against the Grim Reaper, but it was not his time yet. As luck would have it, instead of hitting the ground directly, Alem fell into some pine trees. These trees managed to break what would have been a violent fall and cushioned his landing. It was still a rough landing, and Alem hobbled away with cuts, bruises, a sprained ankle, and the knowledge that he had cheated death. One moment he was riding through the snow, the next, it had him, and oxygen was running out. It was March 3rd, 2023, and Ian Stager, a seasoned snowboarder, was in a precarious position. He had fallen into every snowboarder's worst nightmare. He had fallen into a tree well. One minute Ian was gliding, the next his board snagged and he had disappeared in the snow head first. At first he wasn't too worried because he had been skiing with 3 buddies, but that relief wouldn't last long. Ian's struggles did little to help. In fact, he only continued to sink deeper into the soft snow. He also couldn't reach his radio. 7 minutes passed and it wasn't looking good for him. Then fate intervened. Francis Zuber, a skier with avalanche training and a GoPro strapped to his head, had just gotten through those very trees when a flash of red caught his eye. He stopped and went back for a closer look.
You alright?
That's when it hit him. It was a snowboard, and someone was trapped under the snow. Francis quickly sprang to action, clawing through feet of powder. The most important thing was getting air to Ian because he had no idea how long he had been under. After a minute of frantic digging, he was able to get to his face and hear his first words.
Okay, you're good. You okay? Can you breathe?
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
As Ian drew a breath, Francis got a shovel and began to dig the rest of him out. The video cuts out after that, so it didn't capture when a shaken Ian and Francis shared a relieved hug.
And then we gave each other a big hug, and I told him thank you for stopping.
They returned to the slopes together, forever bonded in a moment that almost ended in disaster. They said the cliffs were beautiful. They didn't warn about the part that could fall on you. This is the Grand Couloir on Mont Blanc, famously called the Corridor of Death. At first glance, it looks just like another section of rock and snow in the French Alps. But this narrow corridor had earned its grim nicknames for a reason. Loose stones and pebbles, freed by thawing ice, could cascade down at any time, and many unfortunate climbers had met their end there. It was this waking nightmare that one climber found herself in July 2020. Her group had crossed to the other side, and she was right in the middle, headed to them. Suddenly, their shouts of encouragement turned to cries of horror. Rocks the size of bricks began to fall, hundreds and hundreds of them. There was no time to make a run for it, so she did the only thing plausible. She took a crouching position and used her helmet and backpack to protect herself. For a second, it looked like she could get out of it, but then her teammates heard her scream. Concerned that she would pass out and be even more exposed, they tried to get to her, but the unpredictable rock falls put a halt on that plan. Somehow, through sheer blind luck and instinct, she survived, and a rescue team later airlifted her to safety. Despite the danger, many nature lovers continue to brave the gully with a painful reminder that the sound of a rock falling could spell doom. If you made it this far, go ahead and hit like and subscribe, because things are about to get way more disturbing. Level 3. This was the instant Edouard Bazin, a French skier, slipped from daylight into an icy coffin that tried to swallow him whole. Edouard and a friend were descending a steep gully on a glacier in France, their helmets recording the blanket white scenery. Then came the dreaded scream.
Merde! No! No! Ah!
Edouard's friend had triggered a small avalanche, and while he was able to get to safety, Edouard wasn't so lucky. The avalanche had hurled him into a 3-meter deep crevasse with enough force for him to feel pain coming from his leg. He would later be diagnosed with a knee ligament injury. From above, Bazin's friend froze for a heartbeat. Neither of them had planned for this. There were no ropes at hand, no quick draw rescue gear, just ski poles. Like that wasn't bad enough, there was no telling how deep the crevasse could go. Carefully, he poked at the snow above his trapped friend, while trying not to dump more weight on the already fragile edge. The two eventually came up with a risky plan to get him out of safety. Edouard wouldn't have to climb out inch by inch with nothing but ski poles and a pickaxe. Eventually, Edouard made it out, but his broken knee kept him from going down the mountain, and a rescue helicopter had to take him to safety. Bazone later admitted the day was full of mistakes, not taking a climbing rope or fully reading the terrain, and then the thin snow bridge he stepped on. He shared the footage not for thrills, but as a lesson. The mountains don't forgive carelessness. She was meant to soar over the gorge, but that wasn't what happened. On June 8, 2025, in the quiet hills of Manali, India, what should have been a joyful summer thrill turned into a nightmare for 12-year-old Trisha Bijwe. She was on a zip line, a popular attraction promising a swift glide above the valley. Moments before getting on, she took a picture with her father with no idea that the ride would betray her or that it would be her last smile for a while. She was midway across when it suddenly happened. The harness rope had snapped and Trisha hurtled down 30 feet onto the jagged stones of the ravine. Emergency responders rushed her to the hospital, and her injuries were as severe as you'd expect. Multiple fractures on her legs and across her body. It would take a while for her to be fully healed. Local authorities looked into the incident and found out that what seemed like an accident was really a time bomb waiting to go off. The zipline facility was operating without the necessary permissions or safety clearances. Adventurers and families alike were left with one question: was the lure of thrill rides worth the risk when lives hang by a rope and a snap can change everything? Probably not. The chairs should have carried people safely up the snowy slope. Instead, they turned into a runaway roller coaster of metal and panic. This all played out on March 16, 2018. Holidaymakers were waiting their turn on a ski lift at the Gudari ski resort in Georgia when screams broke out. There had been a power outage. All the operator needed to do was switch the system over to its backup diesel generator, but they failed to follow the specific emergency procedures, which led to a failure in the lift's anti-roll back system. The result was a bizarre accident no one saw coming. One moment, the holiday goers were in the air, waiting to get off at the top, and the next, they were moving backwards at a high speed. Skiers and snowboarders, desperate to avoid being dragged into the wreckage of twisted chairs, jumped into deep snow below. Those who didn't were flung from their seat, while the unlucky few were violently smashed into the wreckage of chairs piling up. 11 people were injured with broken bones, concussions, cuts, and bruises. One unfortunate tourist even broke his spine, ending up in the ICU. The operators who were responsible for the accident were suspended. To save the resort's reputation, victims were quickly compensated and invited to come for future seasons free of charge. But there is no forgetting the moment a leisurely adventure up there turned into screams. When Carlos Sotomayor stepped off the cliff, he ended up in what many would call a living nightmare. It was August 13, 2025, and Carlos Sotomayor, a Brazilian firefighter and lifeguard, had just jumped off the jagged heights of Pedra dos Cabritos in Castelo, Brazil, a 2,800-foot drop. He was attempting what he thought would be a thrilling base jump, but all that thrill went out the window the moment he released his parachute. Carlos's chute had opened incorrectly and become twisted, robbing him of control and doing little to slow him down. Even a veteran base jumper would have struggled to untangle the chute, not to mention Carlos, who was only on his 6th jump. He barely had time to brace himself for what was coming. He was violently slammed against the cliff again and again. It only got worse from there. Carlos hit the floor hard. When rescuers found him, he was unconscious with multiple serious injuries, fractures to ribs and leg bones, damage to his lung, and deep bruising. He had to be airlifted to the hospital for treatment. He was discharged 10 days later, but is still recovering. At the Nazaré Tow Surfing Challenge of February 2020, Portuguese surfer Alex Botelho found himself in one of the most terrifying situations that any surfer could be in. After riding a massive wave, his partner Hugo Vau had picked him up on a jet ski to get him out of the impact zone. But the ocean had other ideas. As they tried to outrun the ocean, a monstrous wave had struck from the front, launching both men and the ski into the air like ragdolls. In that instance, the jet ski collided with Alex, knocking him unconscious. Rescue crews rushed in and pulled his unconscious body out the water 6 minutes after he'd been knocked out. It would take another 4 minutes before he was breathing again. That was a total of 10 minutes without oxygen, and there were concerns that he could have suffered from brain damage. But despite the prolonged oxygen deprivation, doctors didn't find any signs of neurological damage. But Botelho's other injuries were quite severe. Both his lungs were filled with water, and he contracted a bacterial infection from the salt water. For a while, he couldn't breathe without assistance. He spent 2 weeks in the hospital and another 4 months recovering before heading back to the ocean to do what he did best: surfing. Level 4. His jump was meant to go down as a first, but it ended not with a record, but with screams. On December 28, 2018, 27-year-old base jumper Chad Smith stood at a 180-foot high cliff in England, ready to throw himself off it for his chance at fame. If all went according to plan, he would be the first ever jumper from a low section on that cliff. Chad ran towards the cliff edge and leapt, trusting the parachute in his pack to open in time. But something went wrong. He had mistakenly thrown his pilot chute downward instead of upward, delaying the parachute's deployment. His friends could only look on in terror as he got closer to the ground, certain they were watching his final moments. But just a few meters from the jagged stones, the parachute finally opened, snatching him from certain death. Chad was not okay. The last-second salvation had come at a brutal price. He had slammed face first into the rocky beach and ended up breaking 4 vertebrae and his pelvis in the impact. Injuries so severe that he needed to be airlifted by helicopter to the nearest hospital. He would spend 3 weeks getting treated and another few months recovering. Even though the cliffs almost claimed his life, Chad Smith didn't walk away from extreme sports and even vowed to return to those very cliffs to reclaim his loss. Deep snow, usually a skier's favorite sight, led to a deadly event that no one saw coming. It was the morning of January 10th, 2024. Skiers and snowboarders at the iconic Palisades Tahoe ski resort in California's Olympic Valley were on the slopes. Then, around 9:30 a.m., mere minutes after the lifts opened, something no one expected happened. An enormous mass of snow had snapped loose from the steep slope above and rushed downward, creating an avalanche, sweeping people downhill and burying others. Resort personnel, local fire crews, sheriff's deputies, and volunteers sprang into action as they tried to locate and rescue those who had been buried. A couple were found without a hitch, while 3 people who had been caught in the slide sustained injuries before being treated and released. They were the lucky ones. 66-year-old Kenneth Kidd had been buried in the avalanche and was later pronounced dead from his injuries. A dream to enjoy a day out ended in tragedy. On July 30th, 2022, what was supposed to be a lazy tubing trip on the Apple River in Wisconsin quietly slid into something much darker. 52-year-old Nikolai Mew was looking for a phone he dropped while tubing on the river when he crossed paths with a group of drunk, rowdy teenagers and became suspicious. When Nikolai realized his mistake, he moved on with his search. That should have been the end of it, but it wasn't. The teen's shouts soon caught the attention of the other people in the river, who started to confront him as well. That's when the person holding the camera made a dangerous accusation that would change everything. Madison Cohen was the first person to put her hands on Nikolai, but that arm grab would soon be the least of his problems. As bad as this looks, it was about to get a lot worse. None of them knew it, but Nikolai had a pocket knife, and when 17-year-old Isaac Schumann had put his hands around his neck, Nikolai went for it. Isaac died almost immediately. 4 others were injured. Then Nikolai escaped on a tube, drifting away from the chaos. When the police caught him later, he said he'd been terrified and had acted in self-defense. The court didn't see it that way. In 2024, Nikolai was convicted of reckless homicide and battery and sentenced to 20 years in prison. For some, it felt like justice. For others, it felt excessive, especially when the video surfaced online. Some said Nikolai should have walked away sooner. Others said the teens turned a bad moment into a lethal one. What everyone agreed on was this: a sunny river, a lost phone, and a few shattered words were all it took for the day to turn deadly. When 33-year-old Yevgenia Leontieva stepped off the edge, she was looking for a thrill, but ended up with much more than what she asked for. On October 10, 2021, the mother of 3 was with her husband on the rooftop of a hotel. They, along with a handful of others, were there with an instructor to take part in rope free-flying, a daring jump that blends the thrill of bungee jumping with the adrenaline of freefall. But the leap turned into horror almost immediately after she walked off the roof. It turned out the instructor had signaled for Leontieva to jump before her safety rope. The lifeline meant to catch her fall was not properly attached to a secure point on the ground. The results were catastrophic. Leontieva fell 82 feet into the street below and was dragged several feet by the slackline before coming to an abrupt stop. Emergency responders transported her to a hospital where doctors tried to save her life, but her injuries were just too severe, and she was pronounced dead shortly after arrival. A criminal investigation was launched into the incident, and the instructor, Alexander Muznikas, was convicted of negligence and sentenced to 4 years in prison. One single mistake that would leave 3 children without a mother and a husband without his wife. Level 5. 1 second, Sergio Murillo Lima de Santana was smiling at his camera. The next, he was gone. On October 10, 2022, the 39-year-old was on the 6th day of his vacation in Ceará, Brazil with his partner when they decided to take a ride on a zip line. It was a popular tourist attraction in the region and set up over sand and low dunes. Sergio got out his phone for a selfie-style video that captured his laughs and smiles as the mechanism pulled him forward along the cable. Then, in the blink of an eye, the footage switched to chaos. His partner captured the moment disaster struck. One of the supporting beams collapsed, taking down the entire structure. Sergio was left to fall 30 feet to the sandy ground below as his partner rushed over to him, but there was nothing anyone could do to help him. Sergio was pronounced dead on arrival at the emergency care unit. An investigation would later determine that the collapse was caused by structural weakness, maintenance issues, and overloading of the zipline setup. The operator of the attraction was charged with manslaughter. A seemingly harmless adventure turned into a tragedy in a flash. On May 28, 2025, 19-year-old Serbian model Tijana Radonjic was parasailing for the very first time in Budva, Montenegro. It was a sweet deal from a local water sports company, a free ride in exchange for footage. It seemed like a win-win, till it wasn't. After she was shown the ropes, Tijana took to the air. Witnesses say she seemed happy and relaxed as she ascended into the sky above the sea, waving at relatives and friends below. Then things took an unexpected turn. She was roughly 160 feet in the air when her demeanor changed. In one moment, she had taken off her life jacket. Some even reported hearing her shout, "Put me down," but no one expected what would happen next. Tijana had unfastened the harness and safety straps that secured her to the parasail rig. For one moment, she clung on, but the next, she fell 160 feet into the water far below. She was pronounced dead on the scene. No one knows what happened up there. Some say she had a panic attack, others believe she had suddenly become scared of heights. No one knows the answer. One woman's step off a bridge for a thrill becomes a step too far. On July 18, 2021, 25-year-old Colombian lawyer and student Yesenia Morales Gomez was at a well-known bungee jumping spot in northern Colombia with her boyfriend, preparing for her very first bungee jump. She only had on a safety harness, and her instructor was guiding her when disaster struck. After hearing the instructor count down and say jump in Spanish, Yesenia did as she was instructed and made the 150-foot jump, but she was not attached to the safety cord. Bystanders rushed to get her out of the water, but it was too late. Yesenia died before she ever hit the ground. An autopsy would later reveal that she had a cardiac arrest mid-fall, most likely the moment she realized that she was not secured. Why would such a careless mistake happen? Some said the instruction had been directed to her boyfriend, who was already attached to the safety equipment and lined up for the next jump on an adjacent platform. But the company overseeing the bungee jumping strongly denied this, saying that only one jumper went at a time and no one was jumping simultaneously. In the end, what should have been her first leap into a new experience turned into a fatal fall in a heartbeat. Nathy Otison's countdown just before he jumped off the edge of a building is one of the most chilling pieces of footage out there, and it's all down to what happened after. On the night of January 27, 2024, the 33-year-old British base jumper was at the top of a 29-story condominium in Pattaya, Thailand. He was a seasoned skydiver and base jumper with over 5,000 jumps to his name. He made a name for himself on social media by documenting his adventures, and this night was no different. He and a friend had illegally climbed to the rooftop of a high-rise apartment block to make a video as he base jumped down to the street below. After setting up his camera on the rooftop, he checked his camera, did a brief inspection of his parachute, and then began the countdown before the leap.
3, 2, 1, see ya!
For a moment, it must have felt like flying. But on the way, Nathy's parachute did not deploy as he intended it to, leaving him in freefall to the ground. Witnesses reported hearing a sickening thud of his body as it slammed into a tree before hitting the ground. By the time his body was discovered and emergency services called, Nathy was gone. Police found the parachute beside him, still not properly opened. It's believed that it was not correctly packed, meaning it never had a real chance to catch the wind and slow his descent. A single mistake that led to unforgiving consequences. Level 6. They thought they were just crossing a stream, but the water had other plans. On June 3, 2024, the rivers in the Shirin Gorge scenic area in China were swollen after a series of rainstorms, making crossing them dangerous or impossible. But two hikers, a woman in white and a man in a red shirt, decided to take the risk. With just a single rope stretched across the water for support and no life jacket on, the two began to cross. That's when it happened. The two were left holding onto the rope as the waterfall dragged them, but the man was able to get his footing. He tried desperately to pull the woman out, but she was quickly going under. It wasn't long before the situation got out of hand. They were pulled into the water but managed to keep their grip on the rope as onlookers rushed down to pull them out. For several minutes, the two held on, but the force of the water proved to be just too strong. Both were swept away downstream, and their bodies were never found. On June 19, 2025, what had been a moderate summer day on the trail quickly became a nightmare that few would survive. That day, a group of hikers was hiking along the base of Bow Glacier Falls in Canada, when suddenly there was a thunderous roar. A large section of cliff rock and earth broke loose without warning, sending huge rocks crashing down the steep slopes. The hikers, who were off guard, resting and taking pictures, were caught unaware and scrambled for safety as the rocks struck them. In the aftermath, 2 were found dead, and many others were seriously injured, with broken bones. The very things that had attracted them to Bow Glacier Falls ended up killing them. When Semra Azal took a series of laughing selfies while on holiday with her husband, she had no idea that footage would be played in court. In June 2018, 32-year-old Semra was in Turkey with her husband, Hakan Azal. She was 7 months pregnant and enjoying her baby moon. One of the most popular cliffside tourist spots was Butterfly Valley, and the two were there to enjoy the scenic beauty, even climbing up to a high vantage point to get a better view. There, many people spotted Semra and Hakan posing for a selfie on the edge. One tourist even made a video that captured the two. They were all blissfully unaware of what was about to happen. Later, Hakan flagged down a passing motorist to say that Semra had fallen down a cliff. By the time they had found her body, she was dead. Hakan said he had looked away for a moment and she'd slipped. It was all a tragic accident, or was it? Investigators and family members weren't so sure, and as they looked deeper into it, troubling details began to emerge. Semra was reportedly afraid of heights, yet they had dilly-dallied on those cliffs for about 3 hours. The authorities believed that Hakan had lured her to the rocky cliffs on the pretext of taking photos, then urged her to stay that long to make sure no one was around when he pushed her. All this was tied to what he'd done just days after her death. Tried to collect an insurance payout for a personal accident insurance policy that came to about $25,000, a policy he had taken out a short time before she died. They also discovered Hakan had taken out loans in her name, loans that she knew nothing about. In November 2022, a Turkish court found Azal guilty of premeditated murder and sentenced him to aggravated life imprisonment, meaning he must serve at least 30 years before he's even eligible for release. A holiday meant to capture happy moments was just a plan to end 2 lives for profit. Level 7. The natural seawater pool of Isla Cangrejo in Spain is usually a beehive of activity for tourists. But on December 7, 2025, the authorities hadn't put up red flags and police tape around warning people off the location. That was because of a weather advisory for rough seas and warnings of high surf. But some tourists were undeterred and went into the pool. Hours passed and it seemed like the authorities had made a big deal about nothing, but that all changed in an instant.
What are you doing?
A massive rogue wave smashed over the low concrete barrier and swept a group of swimmers from the pool out into the open Atlantic, where they were hit with wave after wave. The other swimmers rallied to get them out. In the end, only one person could be rescued while the rest were dragged out to sea. Later, rescue operations deployed jet skis and helicopters to find survivors. 3 were found dead. A 4th was airlifted to the hospital but died the following day, while 1 more was never found. On January 8, 2022, a normal hot day at Furnace Lake in Brazil turned into a scene straight from a horror movie. A group of tourists on pleasure boats in Brazil was merely cruising the lake, snapping photos and laughing. They had no idea what was about to happen. A 20-meter high cliff had suddenly given up its grip and crashed down into the water below. Just imagine a skyrise building suddenly deciding it no longer wanted to be a wall the moment you're right beside it. People who had been laughing just moments before were suddenly thrown into chaos. Four cruise boats were instantly crushed, while others capsized. Some passengers plunged into the water in a desperate bid to escape. Investigations later found that heavy rainfall and natural erosion had weakened the rock face. In the end, 10 people lost their lives, while dozens ended up with various degrees of injuries. One moment, they had been taking photos of a seemingly perfect cliff, and the next, that same cliff was headed right for them.